Electronic Transmittal of Legislation Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7941 to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to permit the Chairman of the Council of the District of Columbia to transmit acts of the District of Columbia to Congress in electronic form.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7941, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Mahoney, and thank you for marking up my District of Columbia Electronic Transmittal of Legislation Act. This bill would bring the congressional review process for legislation adopted by the district into the electronic age by permitting D.C. to transmit legislation electronically. I want to be clear, while I do not believe there should be a congressional review process for D.C. legislation, this bill does not change the review process for D.C. legislation, other than giving the district flexibility in the form it transmits legislation to Congress. This bill has only one purpose: reducing administrative burdens on the district and Congress. The D.C. Home Rule Act requires the chair of the D.C. Council to transmit legislation to Congress for a review period before the legislation may take effect. The legislation takes effect after the review period unless a resolution of disapproval is enacted into law during the review period. The Home Rule Act is silent on the form of transmittal, but Congress has always required the legislation to be physically transmitted. Electronic records are recognized as valid under federal and state law, and the federal government and state and local governments conduct official business electronically. For example, under the Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act, which was enacted into law more than 20 years ago, with respect to any interstate transaction in which the parties consent, quote, a signature, contract, or other record relating to such transaction may not be denied legal effect, validity, or enforceability solely because it is in electronic form. 20 years ago, the E-Government Act, which facilitated the federal government providing information services to the public electronically, was enacted into law. Congress is capable of conducting official business electronically. In fact, the House already does so. For example, the House permits members, including acting through their staff, to introduce legislation and submit statements into the congressional record electronically. The requirement that D.C. physically transmit legislation imposes costs on the Council. The Council engages in a 12-state process to physically transmit legislation, including printing 2 copies of each bill and committee report, arranging a time for delivery for these documents to offices of the Speaker and President of the Senate, having 2 staffers drive to the Capitol to deliver the documents. 2 are required because of parking restrictions. The physical transmittal process also imposes costs on Congress. The following congressional offices and committees are involved in the physical transmittal process: the offices of the Speaker and President of the Senate, the House and Senate parliamentarians, the House Clerk, the Senate Secretary, this committee, and the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. The aftermath of the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol highlighted the burdens of physical transmittal. After temporary fencing was installed around the Capitol, D.C. employees could not enter the Capitol, delaying transmittal of D.C. legislation until Council and congressional staff eventually developed a workaround. D.C. Council and congressional staff arranged to meet outside the fencing to transmit the legislation. I recognize that Congress requires all so-called executive communications, including D.C. legislation, to be physically transmitted, but D.C. is the only entity required to transmit legislation to Congress for a review period, and this committee has jurisdiction over the transmittal process for D.C. legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this bill.
Thank you very much. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer?
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. You know, after just debating federal bureaucrats working from home yesterday, I must oppose this bill. It's not too much to ask D.C. government employees to step away from their computers to formally present legislative documents to the U.S. House and Senate for congressional review. This bill seeks to solve a problem that was not even a problem until Speaker Pelosi erected a 7-foot fence all around the Capitol. I guess security fences are acceptable to Democrats protecting themselves, but they have no desire to erect a wall along the southern border to protect the United States from hundreds of thousands of illegals crossing over illegally every year. Under Democratic control, Congress has steadily become the ultimate ivory tower with access granted to a very select few. Speaker Pelosi and Mayor Bowser have made it difficult for Americans to access their capital. If D.C. government officials had trouble delivering legislation to Congress, they're not alone. The American people have also been barred from attending the Capitol until very recently. Perhaps my Democrat colleagues could instead focus on making the U.S. Capitol more accessible to the American people, instead of chilling the First Amendment right to petition. While I support efforts to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, I will not support solutions to problems of Speaker Pelosi's on making. I urge my colleagues to oppose, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Okay, I now recognize myself to speak on the amendment. I support H.R. 7941. I want to state my strong support for this bill to modernize the process by which the District of Columbia transmits its legislation to Congress. The District of Columbia Electronic Transmittal of Legislation Act could not be more straightforward. The bill would allow the District of Columbia to transmit certain legislation to Congress, which is required to do by law electronically. We live in a digital age. For years, companies have been working across continents using a variety of technologies to communicate electronically. Yet Congress continues to unnecessarily insist that the District of Columbia deliver its legislation by hand in paper. These are not classified documents that require a secure hand-to-hand transfer. They are pieces of legislation that are publicly available. Delivering paper documents by hand is unnecessary and antiquated. Congress should allow the District of Columbia to share its legislation using modern communication methods that are readily available. The bill is good government in action. It would help reduce the amount of paper being used, save the D.C. government time, and modernize a currently onerous process. I would like to thank Congresswoman Norton for introducing this important legislation. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Biggs, you seek recognition?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I rise, I guess I should say, move strike last word. Okay, thank you. I rise in opposition to this bill, and I support efforts to make every level of government more efficient, but I would really prefer to make every level of government smaller. This bill is masquerading as a solution to a problem largely of the Democrats' own making when they erected a 7-foot tall fence around the Capitol for most of 2021. We need to return to business as usual in the United States Capitol, opening up businesses and allowing commerce to flourish. Congress itself should stop living in a bubble within the district, receiving outside communications and important notices of local legislation through email. That solution is, as always, changing the institution instead of just using common sense. According to the Washington Post, Democrats' fence around the Capitol led to cloak and dagger operations in which D.C. government employees were meeting at hotels to deliver D.C. council bills to Congress. The problem is not with the requirement to produce hard copies to Congress. The problem is Democrats believe they own the United States Capitol and not the American people. And one of the things that I find interesting is if you want to see how electronic media can be manipulated, just look at the January 6th committee. Never again should American people be prevented from accessing our Capitol. Americans should have access to their representatives. Delivering hard copies of DC bills will also allow a clear demarcation of when Congress can begin its necessary review of DC legislation. That's important. This is a bill in search. It's a bill in search of a problem, and with that, Madam Chair, I oppose and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Clyde, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the United States Constitution says, "The Congress shall have power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district as the District of Columbia." You know, if we would follow the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, then there would be no need for this legislation because the legislation would already be at Congress. And we have seen how the D.C. Home Rule has worked out over the last almost 50 years. It's been a train wreck. After 20 years, the city was in such financial disarray that lending institutions dropped the D.C. bond rating to junk status. That required Congress to implement a financial control board called the Financial Responsibility and Management Assistance Authority. Now, 30 years later, we have a tremendous crime crisis in D.C. It is evident that the D.C. government, in their defund the police mentality, cannot maintain proper law and order. This has resulted in the large surge in crime. You know, and where law enforcement are handicapped in such a way as to not be able to protect the citizenry, citizens need to be able to protect themselves. Even the firearm carry permits in D.C. are woefully inadequate. They're only valid for 2 years, where in Georgia and in the states of our union, they're valid for 5 years. So it's apparent that the D.C. government doesn't trust their constituents like the states trust theirs. So all the residents, including minority residents of the district, are disenfranchised and discriminated against by their own government. Now, I have a solution for that discrimination by the D.C. government, and it's called constitutional carry. We just passed it in Georgia this past April, on April the 12th, and I think the entire city of Washington, D.C. would greatly benefit from it. But I don't think that's where the D.C. government wants to go. You know, people could actually protect themselves while the D.C. government is defunding the police. You know, my final example, well, of the D.C. government's home rule incompetence and complete disrespect is the desecration of our national ensign. That would be the flag of the United States, which has 50 stars and was adopted on August 21st, 1959. It does not have 51 stars. Yesterday was Flag Day, June the 14th, the day we commemorate the adoption of our original flag in 1777. But in the city yesterday, D.C. flew 51 star flags. This is an example of anarchy against our country's law and absolute disrespect for our current flag. So back to the bill in question. The way to fix the transmission of documents from the D.C. government to Congress is to bring D.C. legislation back to Congress and comply with Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. I look forward to next year when Republicans will be in control, when we will hold the gavels, and when we can work on meaningful legislation, like eliminating the disastrous 50-year experiment of D.C. Home Rule. Regarding H.R. 7941, the bill before us today, I encourage all members to vote against this legislation as unnecessary, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Raskin, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to speak, I moved to strike the last word. I was not going to speak on this straightforward legislation to streamline and simplify procedures for the District of Columbia, but I wanted to say something in answer to my colleague from Georgia. The people of Washington, D.C. are the only residents of a national capital on earth who are not represented in their own federal legislature. And they have asked for statehood the way that the people of 37 other states have asked for statehood since the Union began. And others of those states have also demonstrated what the new flag would look like. It's a good thing that the people of DC have decided to use the normal political channels in order to get statehood, despite the fact that they have a real political grievance, unlike the imaginary political grievance of the people who showed up here on January 6th and used American flags to beat up police officers, to spear them in the chest, to hit them over the head, and they threw in some Confederate battle flags as well as some Trump flags. So if you're worried about people desecrating the flag of the United States, you might focus on the people that are using the flag as a weapon to beat up Capitol Police officers, officers of the Metropolitan Police Department, and officers of the Montgomery County Police Department who also were there on that day. That would be a far more serious way to pay attention to desecration of the US flag, which we fought for against a secessionist movement that tried to divide America. And those traitors, of course, were barred from ever serving in federal or state office again for having engaged in rebellion and secession against the Union. That is the constitutional position. Meantime, Eleanor Holmes Norton's constituents are petitioning for admission to the Union the way that they are supposed to do under our Constitution. Now, we began as 13 states, but we have 50 states. We've admitted 37 states under Congress's power under Article 4. Gentleman hasn't opined on statehood, but I suppose that's certainly a bridge too far for him, given that he concluded his remarks by saying he wanted to revoke home rule. It's hard to imagine a more brutal assault on principles of democratic self-government under our Constitution and Declaration of Independence than what the gentleman from Georgia just said. He doesn't even want the people from DC to be able to spend their own locally raised tax dollars the way that they want. And I would just say that, you know, it's beyond me as a faithful, patriotic, democratic citizen of this country to tolerate that kind of offensive assault on a people who are seeking nothing more than their political equality and inclusion under the Constitution of the United States. And they have not desecrated the flag. They honor our flag by asking for admission to the Union the way that 37 of our states have done it, and the way that the original 13 also decided to stick together with Union. But then, of course, there were some states who fell for the absurdity of interposition and nullification and tried to break out.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Or against the Union. Excuse me?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
By all means.
Is the city of Washington, D.C., has it been recognized as a state? Yes or
It
no?
has not been recognized as a state, although the House
Then why in the
Representatives-
world is there 51 stars on a D.C. flag? That's a violation. That is absolute disrespect for our country.
Really? Well, that's your opinion, Mr. Clyde, and under the First Amendment, you have a right to your opinion, but so do the people of Washington, D.C. And they've not been charged with desecrating anybody's flag, and they see that as upholding the highest honor of our flag and our Constitution and our country, because the whole trajectory of democratic development under our Constitution has been to expand democracy to let people in. And I'm sure you're familiar with what Jefferson said at the time of the Northwest Ordinance, and I'm sure what you're familiar with Jefferson's idea that nobody would ever be subordinate in our union, but territories would continually be admitted as states so everybody could exist on a level of political equality, which is why the vast majority of Americans today live in states that were admitted after the original 13 created the Union. And I'm sure you have no problem with that. At least I hope not. Otherwise, are you proposing that we prosecute 713,000 people because they've added a star to their flag as a demonstration of their aspiration to join the Union?
The gentleman's time is
Have you gotten to
expired.
that level of Orwellian censorship?
The gentleman's
I'm happy to
time
yield
has
back,
expired. Okay, who else seeks recognition? Okay, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
Ask for, oh, no.
Okay.
Request a recorded vote.
The question now occurs on favorably reporting out 7941 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 1 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the bill are postponed. And pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5815, the Honest Census Communications Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5815 to amend Chapter 7 of Title 13 United States Code to prohibit certain deceptive practices in relation to a census and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5815 offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 5815. The United States Census is an integral part of American society. The data collected through the census affects the distribution of more than $1.5 trillion in federal funding, apportionment in the House of Representatives, and a range of public and private sector services across the country. Unfortunately, some organizations send out misleading materials that are designed to look like official census documents, but are instead used to support private or partisan causes. In 2010, I was an original co-sponsor of H.R. 5148, a bill by Representative Issa that would clarify the purposes for which the word census could appear on mailable documents. Specifically, the bill required that any mail soliciting contributions or membership fees with the word census seen or through the envelope should clearly indicate the sender's information, include notice that the sender is not the federal government. The bill enjoyed bipartisan support and was passed by voice vote in the House and unanimously in the Senate. H.R. 5815 builds upon those bipartisan efforts to ensure that unofficial communications, either in written or electronic form, do not take the appearance of official census documents and do not impede people from participating in the census. We're going to now put up a 2019 mailer slide. There it is up there on the screen, and read the paragraph below. In 2019 and 2020, the Republican National Committee distributed fundraising materials that very closely resembled official Census Bureau documents with labels like Census Document and 2020 Congressional District Census. Okay, this was outrageous, and the RNC only stopped after I, along with Chairman Raskin and Conley and Porter, sent them a letter demanding that they halt these deceptive communications. This bill would prohibit any communications containing information about the census that is known to be materially false or is communicated with the intent of delaying or preventing someone's participation in the census. The bill, as amended, would allow for civil penalties. This committee is charged with overseeing the Census Bureau, and the decennial census. No one should use the census to confuse or deceive people for any reason. The Honest Census Communications Act will ensure that such deceptive practices do not happen in the future. I want to commend Congresswoman Eshoo for introducing this bill, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Does anyone seek recognition? Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Under the Trump administration, the Census Bureau combated fraud by establishing the first-ever Trust and Safety Team. This was necessary to prevent fraudsters from scamming potential census respondents out of sensitive personal information such as their Social Security numbers. However, this bill does not prevent thieves from stealing sensitive information. Instead, the bill focuses on the alleged problem of someone making false statements to obstruct another person from participating in census surveys. We already have criminal penalties to cover such acts. False statements made over the wire through the mail, for example, are already covered by criminal mail and wire fraud offenses. Therefore, this bill is unnecessary, and I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 5815. I yield back.
Ms. Porter is now recognized.
Thank you very much. The Honest Census Communications Act would give the Department of Justice the authority to punish individuals who spread false information about the census. In 2020, we saw hate groups like the American Immigration Control Foundation send out surveys that were intentionally designed to look like official census documents. Scam artists use similar tactics to try and collect personal information from seniors and other vulnerable groups. My office received calls from constituents who received documents from the Republican National Committee that were labeled as official documents, census documents, and the 2020 Congressional District Census. These constituents were understandably confused about whether these documents were from the Census Bureau. My staff explained that they were not census documents, but the incidents raised serious questions about potential misconduct by the RNC and the Trump campaign. But much more importantly, they undermined public trust in the census, a constitutionally mandated process that is fundamental to our democracy. I led a letter with Chairwoman Maloney to the Republican National Committee demanding an end to these deceptive practices. After we sent out our letter, the RNC agreed to stop using the word census in its mailings and digital communications. But scammers and other organizations will continue to do that unless we strengthen the penalties and the law. I am grateful that the chairwoman is now leading this effort to ban misleading communications related to the census. This bill will help protect all Americans, regardless of their political views, from fraud. It will punish those individuals who seek to undermine the integrity of the census and this constitutionally mandated process. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. I rise to oppose H.R. 5815. Folks, this is what the public is tired of, regulation on top of regulation. It seeks to, to do something. It's duplicative. It's unnecessary. Fraudulent conduct is already covered under multiple federal statutes. The fraudsters were trying to get sensitive personal information from individuals for who knows what, and we're not trying to prevent individuals from participating in the census. It's simply a messaging vehicle for the Democrats to once again falsely accuse Republicans of wanting universal participation in the census. If they really want to get at fraud, if they really want to get at true census numbers, let's start with making sure everybody is a legal resident of the United States of America, which is just not happening under this Biden administration. The borders being wide open just continues to give false information, and it should not be tolerated in any case. So I rise to oppose it. I hope my colleagues will join me. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
want that underlying bill.
The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 5815 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the bill are postponed. It is now in order to take postponed votes. Members are reminded to be ready to unmute themselves when they're called on to vote. Members are further reminded that pursuant to House rules, their video must be on in order for them to vote. The question now occurs on the Harrell Amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Tlaib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes no.
The devastating impacts of climate change on food production.
Ms.
in
Brown
the US.
votes no.
Despite when my 16-year-old daughter likes to.
Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes no.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Desagne?
DeSaulnier votes no.
Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions?
Okay, so this is the camera.
Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes yes.
See, I'm right.
Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Meese? Mr. Franklin?
Franklin, aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes aye.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Norman, you are not recorded.
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes.
How am I recorded? Ms. Norton, how am I recorded?
Ms. Norton, you are not recorded.
Ms. Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no.
Mr. Lynch, how have I been recorded?
Mr. Lynch, you are not recorded.
I'd like to vote no. Thank you.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is not recorded.
Ocasio-Cortez votes no.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no.
Madam Chair, this is Mr. DeSaulnier. How am I recorded?
Mr. DeSonia, you are recorded as a no.
Thank you.
Mr. Jordan is not recorded. Mr. Jordan votes yes.
Any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 14 yeas and 20 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question now occurs on Biggs number 1. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Nay.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes no.
Ms. Brown votes no. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes no.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
No.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Desagné?
How is Mr. Krishnamurthy recorded?
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no.
No.
Mr. Gomez? Ms. Presley?
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Yes. Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller? Yes. Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
Franklin, aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes aye.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Mr. Biggs, you are not recorded. Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Higgins, you are not recorded. Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Fox is not recorded.
Fox votes aye.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Jordan is not recorded. Mr. Jordan votes yes.
Madam Chairwoman, how am I recorded?
Mr. LaTurner, you are not recorded.
LaTurner votes aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes.
How is Gomez recorded?
Who?
Mr. Gomez, you are not recorded.
How is
Gomez,
DeSaulnier
no.
recorded?
Mr. Gomez, you are not recorded.
How is DeSaulnier?
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier is not recorded.
Saunier votes no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no.
Mr. Grothman,
Mr. Grothman, you are not recorded.
I'd like to vote yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, this is Fallon. I just wanted to make sure I'm recorded, yes?
Mr. Fallon, you are recorded as a yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 16 yeas and 22 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question now occurs on Biggs number 2 amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Yes, this was right, I'm sorry. It is this.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
No.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes no.
Ms. Brown votes no. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch?
No, pardon me, no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Saunier votes no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Gomez? Ms. Presley?
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer? Yes. Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman? Yes. Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller? Yes. Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde? Yes. Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
Franklin, aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
LaTurner, yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? Yes. Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
Maloney votes no.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Is there any member who has not voted?
Madam Chair, how has Ms. Talib voted?
Thank you, Mr. My good colleague. How is Talib recorded?
Ms. Talib, you are not recorded.
Madam Clerk, I would like to be recorded as a no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
How is Mr. Mfume recorded?
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no.
How is Gomez recorded?
Mr. Gomez, you are not recorded.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no.
Does any member wish to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 15 yeas and 22 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question now occurs on the amendment.
Yep, go ahead.
In the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7951. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7951 as amended, which was previously approved by voice vote.
No, sorry, no. Sorry. All those in favor say aye.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say
All those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it.
recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Sorry about that.
Ms. Norton? Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Richard Bobo.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib?
Talib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes yes.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Ms. Brown?
Yes.
Ms. Brown votes aye. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
DeSaulnier votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions?
No.
Is he here? Oh.
We showed up.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller?
No.
Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? No. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
Allen votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? No. Mr. Donalds votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
This is Ms. Norton. How am I recorded?
Ms. Norton, you are not recorded.
Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
This is Mr. Mfume. How am I recorded?
Mr. Mfume, you are not recorded.
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
How is Rokana recorded?
Mr. Khanna is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye.
Frank Johnson, how am I recorded?
Mr. Johnson, you are not recorded.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Biggs, you are recorded as a no.
Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? Is there any member who has not voted?
How am I recorded? Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Who's that?
Mr. Clyde.
Mr. Clyde.
Mr. Clyde, you're recorded as a no.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 23 yeas and 17 nays.
H.R. 7951 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. The question now occurs on favorably reporting 7941 as amended, which was previously approved by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Lynch votes yes.
Mr. Lynch votes yes.
Here you go.
Cooper votes yes.
Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Yes.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes yes. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes yes. Mr. Khanna?
Yes.
Mr. Khanna votes yes. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes yes. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes yes. Ms. Tlaib?
Tilly votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes yes. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes yes.
Ms. Bush votes yes. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes yes.
Ms. Brown votes yes. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes yes.
Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes yes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes yes. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes yes.
Ms. Kelly votes yes. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes. Mr. Desagne?
Desagne votes yes.
Mr. Desagne votes yes. Mr. Gomez? Ms. Presley?
Presley votes yes.
Ms. Presley votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? No. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? No. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Meese? Mr. Franklin?
Mr. Franklin,
Is he frozen? Mr. Franklin?
I think he's on mute. Can somebody text Scott?
Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
How is Mr. Franklin recorded?
Madam Speaker, Mr. Franklin would like to vote no.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. Donalds? No. Mr. Donalds votes no. Ms. Maloney? Yes. Ms. Maloney votes yes.
How is Mr. Gomez reported?
Mr. Gomez is not recorded.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes yes.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 22 yeas and 17 nays.
HR 7941 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. The question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 5815 as amended, which was previously approved by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly?
Conley votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Yes.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes yes. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes yes. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes yes. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes yes. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes yes. Ms. Tlaib?
Talib votes aye.
Ms. Tlaib votes yes. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes yes.
Ms. Bush votes yes. Ms. Brown?
Yes.
Ms. Brown votes yes. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Mr. Welch?
Yes.
Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Johnson?
Vote aye.
Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes yes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes yes. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes yes.
Ms. Kelly votes yes. Ms. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Sonia votes yes.
DeSaulnier votes yes. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes yes. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes yes.
Ms. Presley votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? No. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? No. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon? Mr. Fallon? Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? No. Mr. Donalds votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes yes.
Madam Chair, is Fallon recorded?
Mr. Fallon, you are not recorded.
Fallon votes no. Thank you.
Mr. Fallon votes no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 22 yeas and 16 nays.
H.R. 5815 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Before we adjourn, we have one final piece of business, which I will dispose of very quickly. Pursuant to notice, I call up the following postal naming bills, which were distributed in advance. H.R. 7518, 7519, 7899, 6218, 6220, 6221. Without objection, the bills are considered read, and I request unanimous consent for their immediate consideration en bloc. Without objection, the bills are passed. There being no further business, I want to thank all of you for your participation today. The committee stands adjourned.